Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar titled Diversity for the Venture Ecosystem, the Key to Thriving Now More Than Ever. I'm Suzanne Basala, President and CEO of the U.S.-Japan Council. Senator Inoue and Irene Hirano Inoue founded this council as an organization built on the values of inclusion, justice, and our common humanity. USJC endeavors to foster people-to-people relationships that reflect those values to strengthen our US-Japan relationship and our communities. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is an extremely timely subject. The business case for diversity is crystal clear. We need to engage in intentional inclusion to unleash the benefits of that diversity. More recently, the conversation is increasingly about equity in the workplace, as well as at the broader society, especially in support of social justice and supporting Black communities. I'm looking forward to hearing our panel explore these topics in the context of the venture ecosystem. Before turning it over to our moderator, I want to take a moment to give special recognition to today's webinar sponsor, fabbit. We've been so grateful to fabbit for its platinum level support of USJC throughout 2020, providing essential support to us in a very turbulent year. I personally have enjoyed getting to know more about fabbit and its operations in the United States and Japan, and I'm pleased that Keisuke Takahashi, Director of Overseas Operations of fabbit, has joined us to say a few words. Takahashi-san?
Thank you, Susan. So my name is Keisuke Takahashi from fabbit San Francisco. So we are very honored to hold this event collaborating with USJC. Thank you very much. And let me briefly introduce the fabbit. fabbit is one of the largest Japanese co-working space with the goal of building a vibrant startup ecosystem and incubating innovations. We have more than 10,000 members and 45 locations, including San Francisco and Silicon Valley. Since we aim to support startups from all angles, we provide more than just space, such as mentoring, corporate innovation programs, acceleration programs, business matching opportunities, and events. So today's topic of diversity is very important for fabbit, and we are very serious about diversity. Thus, we're so proud of having this webinar. Hope everyone enjoy it. Thank you. Back to Suzanne.
Thank you, Takahashi-san. So today, moderating our discussion is Rika Nakazawa, who is a USJC member and co-chair of the USJC Northern California region, leading nearly 100 council leaders in the region. Rika is a senior leader, entrepreneur, investor, and frequent public speaker on technology-powered business transformation. Among other roles, she is the CEO and a founder of Boardseatmeet Incorporated, a Silicon Valley social impact venture focusing on bringing diversity to the boardroom by empowering women to build and leverage social capital with modern technology, ultimately to deliver high-performance boardroom of tomorrow. Since I've been living in Silicon Valley for the past 3 years, I've enjoyed getting to know Rika as a community leader and as a friend. Although I have to admit that it is often easier to find time to catch up when we're both in Tokyo than in our own neighborhoods. Rika is so active and on the move, she's the one person I can't ever imagine actually sheltering in one place for several months. Rika, over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. And yes, we'll have to find other cities outside of the US in which we can rendezvous, maybe other cities in Japan. So thank you very much, and thank you, fabbit, and thank you, US-Japan Council, for making this very important topic and panel session available. And due to COVID and the format here and with the time that we have, we're able to reach the East Coast, West Coast, Pacific Rim, and also folks hopefully from Japan. As Suzanne mentioned, I have been in this space certainly as from a diversity perspective as a women leader in technology. However, most recently, of course, been very mindful around racial equity and other sorts of diversity that I think we all need to be present to, both because it's the right thing to do, but also it's the smart thing to do. Countless studies have shown that diversity leads to high performance, and especially as the world has become infinitely smaller and much more compressed with coronavirus and everybody being in this sort of digital way that we interact, it's become very critical that we address the diversity challenges that exist everywhere, and more specifically in the venture ecosystem. And I'm so excited to have with us today as our esteemed panelists folks that can speak from the startup venture space, as well as people that can speak from the investor space, and people that can speak from the space of corporate venture and in the overall ecosystem of diversity within the working and corporate ecosystem. Before I hand it over to my panelists to introduce themselves, just one housekeeping item that I thought I'd mention. This is an opportunity for us to hear from you, and it's an opportunity for us to get a read as to how diversity is of relevance to you and how you're thinking about the importance of diversity as you maneuver through your organization and within your community. And so what we'll do today to take advantage of the great features that Zoom offers, we're going to have 3 polling questions and really encourage all of you to participate if possible, because we really want to hear some perspectives from the audience. We'll have 3 polling questions. One will start out right after the panelists introduce themselves. We'll have another one as we're in midstream in our conversation today, and we'll also have one more towards the end. And we'll share the results with everybody, and it will give us a sense of how people are thinking about this, how they're looking at this, and any thoughts or comments that they have. So looking forward to hearing your input on the polling questions. So before we get into the content, I can't wait to have you hear about the background and the experiences of our panelists today. And I'll hand it over first to Lisa to introduce herself. Lisa?
Of course, I commit the first sin. I spoke while muted. Sorry about that, everybody. It is truly an honor and a privilege to be part of this event. So thank you all so much. And it's been great getting to meet so many people as we prepared for it. My name is Lisa Shalett, and I have a long history with Japan that I am very proud of. First, starting when I was still in high school and did a homestay living with a Japanese family in Azamino. From that point on, I knew that my career was going to be Japan influenced, and ended up first working at Fuji TV after college. I was an East Asian Studies major at Harvard. Then I went to business school at Harvard Business School and found my way to a job called Japanese Equity Sales, first at Barclays, then at Goldman Sachs, which was fantastic, paid me to talk to smart people about Japan all day. I had a 20-year career at Goldman Sachs where I was a partner, and retired about 5.5 years ago. And since then have been wandering the startup ecosystem, doing my best to help founders, especially female founders, investing a little bit, and otherwise using my somewhat strange background to try to add value.
Thank you, Lisa. So excited to have you here. Andy, would you please go next?
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here today and see everyone. My background is I'm half Japanese, half American, born and raised in Tokyo, Japan, attended international schools, Nishimachi International School for lower and middle, and American School in Japan, ASIJ for high school. So from an early age, I was exposed to lots of different cultures, diversity amongst my classmates. And then for university, I attended UC Santa Barbara, where I double majored in East Asian Studies and Business Economics. I then went and I was working for as a Japanese translator for maybe half a year, and then applied to a school called Thunderbird, which is known for its Master's in International Management. At the time, 1997, US, Japan, Germany were the top 3 economies, so I decided to learn German. And after studying German for 2 years at Thunderbird and graduating, I then applied for an internship at a company called Daimler, which then had their purported marriage made in heaven with Chrysler, which we know it didn't end up, it wasn't a marriage made in heaven. But nevertheless, through Daimler Chrysler, I was sent to Mitsubishi Motors as part of the turnaround team. So I had a German contract. My immediate boss was the head Chrysler guy that they had sent for international sales and marketing. And we had to work together as a Daimler Chrysler team, even though the Germans and the Americans didn't get along with each other, with the Japanese Mitsubishi Motors team to try to help turn around the company. So I got to learn a lot about, interpersonal relationships and dynamics and diversity for that matter. In 2008, together with my brother, Marcus, we opened up a early stage venture capital firm called Quest Venture Partners. I'm happy to say we're on our 3rd fund now. Initially, it was a family office, but we had very good results. So we said, hey, how do we make this into something that'll last for 100 years? Well, we got to bring on other GPs. And other third-party LPs, so limited partners. So we went fundraising, and happy to say we have a lot of Japanese corporates on board, such as Fuji Media Holdings, Sony, Music Entertainment Japan, Nikon, Line, LiveSense, and so on. And you know, I focus on early stage venture capital, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And finally, Stéphane, please. You're on mute.
Or frozen.
Or frozen.
Okay, I can hear you now. I think it dropped very quickly on my side, but I'm back to normal.
You're good.
Okay, great. Hey everyone, so my name is Stéphane Fouche. I was born in Canada, but raised in Haiti. Went to high school in America from 12 to 17, and then college I went to Harvard. And during my time at Harvard, I was able to get the MEC scholarship to study at Kyushu University for a year. Enjoyed my time in Japan, worked in Japan for 5 years before relocating back to America. And throughout the different companies I worked at in Japan, my role really was sort of a cultural ambassador. So given the different places I went to that I grew up with, and in the different languages that I also speak, I was able to work with Japanese companies who were, for example, entering the East African market. So Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda. I also work with different Japanese companies trying to expand their presence in Southeast Asia. So that was the work that I've done in Japan for 5 years, and decided to relocate back to America last year in January.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Stéphane. So, as promised, I have a question for the audience. And also, please remember that there is a Q&A button on the Zoom. And at any point during a conversation, if you have a question that you'd like to bring forward to the panelists or to myself, feel free to type that question into the Q&A. I will be keeping an eye on that and bringing in the questions as it's relevant throughout the conversation. And also we'll have an end of the session Q&A. So before we jump into some of the questions for the panelists that I've prepared, the first poll question is, do you feel that your organization demonstrates enough commitment to diversity at the leadership level? So hopefully folks have been able to reply yes or no. Do we have the results yet? I'm not sure I can see. Okay, so, okay. It's kind of 50-50. That's so in the middle of the road. Okay, great. Well, at least it's not a lot of no's. Okay, that's great. So let's just jump right in. So one of the first questions is, Lisa, maybe you can kick things off for us. So what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you? And I know that those words are used often interchangeably, but would love to hear your perspective on what they mean.
Sure. I think that that phrase means to me that multiple perspectives matter, that safety and belonging and feeling valued matter, and that in order to make it happen, everyone needs to be proactive. There is a great quote from HBS professor Francis Frey, which is, "I can't solve my own inclusion." And so the organization and the team and the culture around me needs to behave in a way such that I feel included. And so that's what I think of when I hear that phrase.
Yeah, good. Okay, Andy, what about you?
Yeah, I think for me, diversity is an acceptance of everyone and everything out there. And it's very important, you know, to never assume that you may know something about someone before you actually talk to them. So, you know, I truly believe that everyone has something to provide to this world, something to say to this world, and you have to give them a chance. But if you don't give them a chance, you're not including them in. So to me, diversity is, you know, is about acceptance and listening.
Yeah, and Stéphane?
For me, it was a bit complicated. I actually had to spend some time with what that definition, that phrase meant. But I tend to see that it stops at race a lot. But then looking just beyond race, it's also like having people with different mindsets, having people with different upbringings. So really having an environment where the other person is not from the exact same background, and being able to communicate your thoughts in a very safe environment. So I think that's probably the most important part for me. Those 3 words really mean creating a safe environment where I'm not afraid to say what I want to, when I'm not afraid to voice my opinion, no matter how controversial it is. And there can be some sort of discourse that can take place. Maybe I was wrong, but then there's a communication line that is taking place where I can still voice my opinion. And again, a very safe environment.
Actually, so that kind of flows into the other question that, so Stéphane, if you can stay with me for a moment. You know, you've hopscotched, and then you took a big jump as you went across the Pacific to Japan. As you've been kind of moving through these different circles, right? In what ways has the presence or lack thereof kind of played a role in the early part of your career?
So I would say in Japan, in early parts of my career, this is again my point of view, so some people might see in different ways. I would say that unlike America, Japan is not as racist. It leans more on the classist route, which means that if I came from an educated background, I present myself very well, I had a better chance. So before being just a Black male in Japan, I was educated, all these other things. And because of that, it made it easier for me to start my career, be able to voice my opinion, because the floor in which I started was better. And that leads back to the idea of equity. So I feel like, in just the race being put aside, if you're educated and you have a certain background and pedigree in Japan, then you're allowed to sit on a stage. And that, I feel, has helped me enter places where, when I was a young adult in Japan, starting my career, most people would never be able to do so. I think at the age of 24, when I was working for a company called DMM, they charged me with running a $1 million budget for a department because I was the only one who was able to speak the Japanese language, speak the foreign language that they needed to, and then be able to work cross borders. So in that situation, I feel like the advantage I had in Japan, I don't think I would have had those same opportunities in America, especially early on in my career.
Interesting. Okay. And so, and Andy, so you're half like me, and also, you know, having grown up in Japan, but then sort of in the work that you've done, working with Germans, working with Americans, working with the Japanese, in what ways has diversity played out in the early parts of your career?
When I was at Chrysler, north of Detroit in Auburn Hills, I was part of the global procurement office, but I sat next to a gentleman who was a manager for the minority supplier development department within the procurement group. And, you know, growing up in Japan, you're either Japanese or you're not. So there's a lot of people, international people, but nevertheless, it's not as diverse as the United States. And especially when you head to, for instance, to Michigan, there are a lot of African-American people there. And this gentleman was African-American, and I wanted to understand, you know, what's the spirit behind the minority supplier development. I mean, yes, you know, I understand we want to, you know, help and support certain ethnic groups and race, but I want to really understand a little bit more. And what he told me made a lot of sense. It was basically, hey, look at your customer base. Who's buying your cars? Who's buying your products? Shouldn't you emulate where you buy your goods, your suppliers, your components in a similar manner as the, you know, distribution of your customers? So, you know, hey, if 20% of our customers are African American, maybe 20% Latino, 20 Asian, I'm not sure, whatever percentage, you should try to emulate that with their sourcing as well, because you know, you're passing from one side to the other. And I found that a very simple way to understand, you know, why it makes sense just to be diverse. It's basically, you know, it's a community, and we're passing goods and services from one side to the other. So, you know, something like the United States, I think it makes a lot of sense to emulate your customer base.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And the world is getting smaller, right? And more integrated. So, and Lisa, what about you? I know early part of your career was very much immersed in Japan. What ways did diversity and or inclusion play a role in your space in those early days?
Sure. So I mentioned when I introduced myself that when I was in high school, I was very fortunate to do a homestay in Japan, and I mention that now because I think that experience to this day affected, who I became. When I went to Japan as maybe a 15-and-a-half-year-old, and stood in the genkan just as I was about to walk into the house. I was told to take off my shoes, and initially my thought was, well, why do they do this? And then when I finished the summer, not speaking fluently, more doing charades, but nonetheless was on my way home, I realized that the right question was, why don't we take off our shoes? And, I think that gave me a sense of literally the importance of putting yourself in another person's shoes, and that empathy has made me a perspective seeker across my career. When I, in my early days, right after college, worked at Fuji TV, I was always conscious of the fact that I was a gaijin. I was a henna gaijin, of course, but it was one of those experiences that I don't have very often here, where in New York, where I am, or in the US, where everyone knows from your appearance that you're different and that you're not a majority. My fun would be getting in a taxi in Japan, and if the driver didn't look at me, I could communicate in Japanese, and there'd be this moment, we'd be stopped at a red light, the driver would look in the rearview mirror, see my face, and freak out, because where did that Japanese voice come from a gaijin face? And that experience always has made me reflect on the fact that whether I'm the only woman in the room, or it's made me reflect on how persons of color might feel when people are judged on the basis of their appearance or their differences. And I think that it's very important not to make assumptions. So those lessons were very early lessons. And when I think about how important empathy is in leading others and in managing others and in making a safe space for others, those have always been top of mind for me. Yeah.
So you've already talked about some personal experiences. If you don't mind, I'd like to dig in a little bit more, Lisa, and maybe talk perhaps about any specific challenges or issues that have come up based on your personal experiences. And hopefully, those challenges or those issues that came out on the other side that made everybody better. But I'd love to hear anything more specific you could share with us.
Sure. I think that it's always I think and a situation where you hope you're not being chosen for something in order to check a box. You hope you're being chosen for something because you're a qualified person first, and the diversity that you might bring is a plus. In my case, it would be being a woman in the room, in financial services, for example, or in a lot of other places, or the boardroom, or wherever that might be. And I think it's always tough, because on the one hand, you might be worried that you're thought of that way, and then sometimes that seeps into your brain and you start to get like all sorts of insecurity and imposter syndrome around, well, what if I was chosen for that reason as opposed to my qualifications? And I think you just have to manage that and shut down the voices in your head that get in your way. You learn that over time. But where I have seen this come up as I've been in a leadership role, so able to manage situations and sometimes shut them down, is you have a performance review situation, or you're evaluating a person for promotion, and you get into the female versus male qualities, and a woman has sharp elbows, but a man is praised for being ambitious. Or again, there are assumptions made about people, for example, whether we should show an opportunity for a woman because she has kids, and would she ever want to move overseas to Japan? things that might not be considered for a man necessarily in the same, in the same circumstance. Or, I've always found that it's often for underrepresented groups that an opportunity is seen as too early. We don't want to promote them too early, because we're worried, maybe even well-intentioned in our worry, that they just might not succeed. We want to promote them and have them succeed, be a role model, whatever it might be. Whereas sometimes, I see, again, not to make this all about gender, but sometimes people are selected for their potential when they may not be ready either, but somehow the underrepresented groups are always, too early. And the other thing that I'd say is in terms of, how people in underrepresented groups sometimes don't get the same information about their organization or about how processes work. And sometimes that can affect how you find mentors. So women, for example, will seek women mentors, but the women mentors are not always the ones in the room making the decisions. And so it's just interesting to see how those outcomes play out.
Yeah, and actually, Stéphane, if you can talk specifically, because we do have a question here that I think is very relevant. It's from the audience, and it's actually perfect timing. So let me read the question, and then Stéphane, I'll ask you to expound on it. So some Japanese companies are changing, but do you think Japanese companies in general really understand what diversity is and the importance of it, versus do they feel obligated to change as they get the pressure from their investors and global corporate community? And the reason, Stéphane, I'd love for you to field that question first from Abe-san, from the audience. Thank you very much, Abe-san, is you're an entrepreneur. And the topic of African-American or Black in the entrepreneurship or venture funding ecosystem is of a very, very hot topic today. But you're kind of in that juxtaposition of Japan intersecting with that whole topic. So would love to hear your perspectives and any issues or challenges and anything specifically you want to respond to Abe-san's question.
Sure. I'll try to condense the whole conversation, not to make it too long. But then thank you, Lisa, for sharing your experiences in Japan, because it feels like it reflects heavily what I've also experienced in Japan. If we give it a name, I would say tokenism. Tokenism in Japan has probably been a double-edged sword. So I still remember when I was working for a large IT firm in Japan, they were expanding to Africa, and I was recruited. They go, great, we have an African-American male, he speaks Japanese, he speaks English, he speaks French, which means we can bring him to Rwanda. It's perfect for that. But they never actually asked me where I'm from. So the question is, so which part of Africa are you from? And my answer was, I'm actually from the Caribbean, I'm from Haiti. Oh, where in Africa is that? It's actually not in Africa, it's in the Caribbean. So there wasn't that full step forward. It was more like Lisa said, like checking the box, making sure we have that person there, and making sure that you had a person who can represent the organization, but specifically someone who spoke Japanese. So someone who was part of us because he spoke Japanese. So that's the other part of the tokenism aspect. If you can speak the language and you can show understanding of the culture, that's the benefit I had in Japan, where I was able to infiltrate myself in places where other people were not able to. The other way around is that once they hired me, it was as if they completed their diversity and inclusion and equity mandate. There's no need to hire other individuals. So this is why I end up becoming very lonely. I don't have someone to talk to. And although I was the manager of a whole department, I had like a kanrisha. So I had someone above me that was supervising every single thing that I was doing. So on paper, visually, it seemed like I was free. But in reality, I had a watchdog that was following me everywhere and every single step that I was doing. So it's very similar if we put in the actual day-to-day age of a Black male walking in a store and having someone following them everywhere. If we put that in a very corporate environment, it was the same thing. Their influence was, oh, we're just trying to make sure you're okay, that you can do all the work, we're here to support you. But the way it was exercised, that's not how I felt. I felt like I was being watched and scrutinized every single step along the way. I was very lucky. So when I decided to leave that company and launch my first organization in Japan, my first startup, they were my first client. And I sat down with the leadership there, especially one of the supervisors. He wasn't the best supervisor, but he believed in me. And I asked him, so what did I do that was so different? And he was trying to be positive, but his words just stinged. And they go, oh, we don't like these other people. These other Black people are scary, but you're okay. You're good. We know you. So he was trying to say that I was doing a great job and I can be trusted. But the way I digest it is, but those people that you're calling those people, I'm part of that same group. So what are you trying to say? So this is where I was sort of encapsulated as being different, being put in a special bucket, which is great for me personally, but what about other people who are like me? And what ends up happening in the end is there's this feeling of being very lonely. And I really want to bring the imposter syndrome that Lisa mentioned is, am I being placed here just to fill up a position, a checkbox, and just so for a brand can be made? Or am I really being placed here because I actually have the skills? And I think that this is something that even till now, I question myself. I was like, would I have been able to do this in America? Would I have been able to do this in a different context if it wasn't for the context of using that tokenism card and being where it is? As time passes by and I'm getting older, I feel like, no, I did have the skills. I just have to give myself a bit more credit. And I need to do a lot more self-deprecation. But to get there, this is where I had to actively seek out for mentors. And these are the individuals who are pointing out those very negative habits that I built living in Japan.
Yeah, no, thank you, Stéphane. I think, Lisa, I think you wanted to mention something too, right?
Yeah, if it's okay, I just wanted to answer Abe-san's question because I think it's a really important point. When it comes to change and let's say a greater awareness of the importance of diversity and inclusion, I welcome outside pressure. Yes, it would be nice if everybody got on the same page and outside pressure weren't needed, but I always look for sources of outside pressure, whether that's from investors asking questions, whether that's from employees being activists and raising issues, whether that is from, ESG activists or whatever it is. I think that ultimately, the value of diversity is learned and sometimes learned by doing and having diverse employees or teams around you. If that's not your original idea and you're forced into it, eventually you see the benefit of it. So I love when there are sources of outside pressure, and you see that also on corporate boards, and you see that also in a lot of the race discussions in the United States right now. It's forcing people to hold up a mirror and say, uh-oh, we're not diverse. And even if it's just in response to pressure, it's fine. You get to a much better understanding. So I love that question.
Yeah, and actually, Andy, so Abe-san's question has so many different angles. So one thing that I'd love to direct to you as an impromptu question out of Abe-san's question is, so you're in the investor community and you're working with a lot of corporate venture groups. To what extent do you see that pressure or an awareness or an understanding of thinking about diversity when it comes to venture funding?
Well, if I can first take a step back and address, maybe focus on the Japan side of corporates and diversity. I think the biggest underutilized resource in Japan is their female professionals and putting them into management positions. I had the experience in working at Mitsubishi Motors, and there's hardly any managers there. I think things are changing, but they're not changing quick enough. I know Abe has put in some policy towards this, but there is so much more talent that can be put into senior management positions within Japanese corporations by the female population. And I honestly believe that that's the single most underutilized resource in Japan right now. With regard to corporate venture activities and their understanding of diversity, with the recent Black Lives Matter movement, a few prominent venture capitalists, corporate for SoftBank, for example, set up a diversity fund. Intel has had one for a while now, but I think they re-upped some of their funding. So yes, corporate venture activity, they do try to promote diversity. I think as a smart investor, you should not pattern match yourself, or you should not have any precognitive understandings of what this investment or this founder or this person may be about without actually listening to them. So that's something I try really hard as an investor to do, is not have any notions that this is how this is going to be, or this person from this background is going to probably be like that. I try to go in with a blank slate so that I can truly appreciate the individual and their approach towards the idea, so I can make an investment purely based on my interaction as opposed to any preconceptions. It's easier said than done, and I think it's part of our psyche, unfortunately. But by consistently trying to remind ourselves and our colleagues that, you know, you need to give the person a chance. And I even tell my daughter, that beggar, you have to, that person may be begging, but if they have something to say to you, give them time and listen before you make your mind and decide not to talk to the person. Every person has something to say. So as an investor, I think, you know, having that mindset is very, very important. And I'm glad also corporate venture funds are also, you know, increasing their support towards investment in diversity.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and we've talked about how important diversity is, and it's not just diversity of race or gender, it's also diversity of thought, just in the way that it's expressed. So especially from my experience with Japan, the other ceiling to crack is really around the age diversity, right? Is really about realizing that all of us are in a generation where the workforce is going to be, and already is in some places, 4 generations deep. And with the life expectancy in Japan, maybe in Japan it'll be 5 generations deep soon enough. But the idea is, how do we make sure that we get the different expressions of thought and differences in thought into a room? And again, Lisa, as you said, either that the boardroom or C-suite or within a team community. So we know that diversity is certainly, from an equity perspective, the right thing to do. And we also know that diversity is a smart thing to do because of studies from McKinsey and Deloitte that have evidenced that diversity yields better business outcomes. And so let's talk about that as well. You know, Andy, I'll just come back to you for a minute, because there's a lot of talk right now about the outcomes from a venture funding perspective, and really, as you said, not just to pattern match to things that you know, but what are some of the things that you're hearing as it's related to outcomes on investing when you focus on diversity?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, we usually invest in multiple founders of a startup, meaning it's usually not just one founder who's starting the company. And so we tend to look at how diverse is the founding base, you know. And we like, obviously, to have male and female representation because, you know, once again, the customer base, most of the time you're dealing with the rest of the world, and that's split between male and female. A lot of times we've made investments into foreign nationals where I don't think they really had the opportunity to present to other investors. One, due to the fact that, you know, maybe some US-based investors are just not interested in investing outside of the United States, or for that matter, taking the time to really understand what, you know, what's the motivation and the goals that may be unique for a foreign founder. For investors, whenever you know, for me, it's very important to understand what's the definition of success for the founder, because that's usually tied to the liquidity event for an investor, you know, because the founder wants to obviously reach success before they sell somehow. And if they can't reach that success, and if you don't know what that is, then it's going to be very difficult to understand when you may be able to get your money back. But we've, you know, for instance, Germans are fairly direct, but they're not buddy off of the beginning. They're not like, hey, you know, you ask them, how are things going? How are you? And they'll say sometimes, not good today. In the morning, I stubbed my toe. That, you know, they're more matter of the fact. Whereas in the United States, how are you doing? Oh, great, everything's good, right? And each one has their own approach. But when you're listening to perhaps a German founder, if you don't have that understanding and appreciation for diversity, you may just think that this founder is very negative towards life and very difficult to communicate to and boring. But I think, you know, my brother and I are half Japanese. Our other partner is Dutch. We come from an international background, have a global mindset. And I think diversity also covers, obviously international cultures and understandings. And by giving the opportunity for the individual to express themselves for who they are, I think is what's most important. And that's, as an investor, how I approach diversity a lot of time.
Yeah, so Andy, just, Mark Ieki is asking a question, so I'll just tie it in here with what you were saying. His question is around, do you think that investors are doing this because, that there's a pressure to do it, or because they really believe in the outcomes? You've shared your personal principles with your investment fund, but what do you see happening around you? Do you feel like people are feeling the pressure, or do you think people are really waking up and realizing that the outcomes are there if they focus on diversity?
I hope they're realizing the reality. I agree with Lisa. If there is external pressure, I welcome that as well, because it's a change towards the better. But I don't think everyone's committed yet. Humans are creatures of comfort, unfortunately, and also what served them good in the past, they tend to continue to do the same thing forward. So you need to break out of that the mold somehow. And I guess it's all about expectations too, making sure you don't let your expectations get ahead of you. You don't let your mind pattern matching of what the outcome or what this may be dictate your decision. Be open towards it. So yeah.
Lisa, Goldman Sachs, right? The sort of one of the bastions of investment, different kind, not venture funding necessarily, although Goldman's getting into that. But so, what about your experience and what you've come across with regards to their perspective on outcomes, business outcomes from diversity investing?
I remember years ago, thankfully it was years ago, being on a diversity task force, which Goldman was committed to. So it was a very diverse senior group of folks committed to diversity on behalf of the firm, coming up with ideas and recommendations. That discussion was still about building the business case for diversity. And so many of us in the room were rolling our eyes that still had to happen. And thankfully, we've moved far, far away from that. And, you see, for example, Goldman doing things like Launch with GS, which is meant to really be a way for Goldman to help the startup ecosystem. And just today, they did the launch of a cohort of Black and Latinx founders. And so, it's really about ensuring that there's a proactivity to seeking diversity, creating diverse cohorts, putting your finger on the scale if that's needed in order to surface those opportunities, and then really just, doing the best that you can to, create reasons for those kinds of firms to succeed. The notion is that sometimes it's just an awareness issue. Sometimes it's, an exposure and lack of ability to get funds issue. And if you start to overcompensate for those things, at least initially, then those companies have an opportunity to succeed that frankly they probably already would have had. They likely have a great idea. They just are having some obstacles in seeing that idea come to the forefront. So I think there's great pride in those outcomes and in using resources to, enable that to become more the norm. That's what I see happening a lot, and I strongly encourage that. But clearly, we need to do a lot more.
Yeah. So speaking of which, let's question for the audience. So we're going to ask our second poll question. So if you can get ready to answer, please. And this is very much on topic with what we've just been talking about. So if we can cue up the poll, thank you. So how do you think diversity, equity, and inclusion could be most positively impacted in your business communities? So sponsored programs to communicate the benefits of DE&I, shared stories of success on a regular basis, and or highlight regular guest speakers within your communities and offices. So let's give everyone 10 seconds to click a box or 2 or 3, see what the results are. Do we have the answers? And then we'll go to a question. Yeah, so shared stories of success. I think that that's really key because that's what really lights up the imagination and people can see that it's been done before. So, and I encourage everybody to really kind of think about these and feel like that this is something that they can take action on themselves and hopefully reach out to the speakers after this and hear about their success stories. So let's go to actually one of the questions that's from the audience. So, Stéphane, I'm gonna direct this one to you. So Kondo-san asks, if you are the only one, minority of thought, generation, race, gender, or sexual orientation, what are some strategies on how people can do to bring up issues around equity and inclusion in your organization or workplace, especially in Japan, where sameness, egalitarianism is the unspoken rule? I'm sure you've been challenged with that on more than one occasion, Stéphane.
That one is hard. The smaller the organization, the harder it is because you end up having groupthink. The bigger the organization, the more disconnected it is. And through that disconnection is really where you can do a little bit of innovation and you have a little bit of wiggle room. But simply said, no innovation is going to come internally. You always need to have it come from the outside. In the case of DMM, if I take my experience there, I was someone that came from the outside. I was hired full-time, but working under the chairman, and I was sort of free. I wasn't under any department, so I was floating anywhere, which means that I had full freedom to do whatever I needed. So just like any big company, if you like to look at Deloitte and the rest, they have auditors that are free to move around. So that I was given that position. If you're not giving a budget and you're not giving that support, and they're telling you, oh, you should try to work internally to change the organization, you're being set up for a mission impossible. It's just really hard to do so. Now, when it comes to the outside influence, it's just the way of introducing an outside player. I noticed that Japan, similar to my colleagues in France, I noticed that is not very happy of dishing their dirty laundry outside. They're not very happy with getting consultants, for example, to come in, which means getting outside players is not always accepted. It's the role of that person who is bringing that external pressure to be very smooth in their ways of doing so and being patient. I am by far the worst person when it comes to describing being patient. I am very impatient, but Japan has very much made me more patient. Kado Totta has made me smoothen the curves by really trying to like scaffold what I was trying to show to my supervisors. It just takes time. So my recommendation is you need to have some sort of agency and organization. You need to have some sort of internal support coming from a higher level in the organization. Budget needs to be allocated. And the last part is the pressure has to come from the outside. It cannot come from the inside. And that person who is bringing the pressure in is just a bridge to bring that pressure into the organization.
Yeah, great. Stéphane, Lisa or Andy, do you have any other comments on the question?
I mean, just quickly, I would say for Japan, you need to get rid of that shoganai mentality. It's not shoganai, nanka shio. Let's do something about it. So I think that would be a good step in making sure that people don't feel as though it is what it is.
And I would just say that, this is where at the same time that, the burden should not be put on the person who stands out or is not the same. Sometimes I think in Japan, the burden falls on that person and they're stuck making the case for diversity. But I think the way to do that is to just start to build one-on-one relationships so that eventually you're not the only one in the room that is highlighting the value of different perspectives. And, everybody is unique in some way. It just may not be as apparent. There are ways to talk about people's uniqueness. Sometimes, everyone has their trick or their secret skill or their, song that they're really good at in karaoke. I don't mean to diminish it, but everyone has something that they identify with that makes them unique. And there are ways to broaden the thinking about that, even in a sea of sameness.
Yeah. Actually, Andy, I think you should do a bangumi called Nakashio.
Okay.
Lisa has connections. Lisa has connections in Japanese media, so I'm sure she can hook you up.
Yarose.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take one more question from the audience here. These are really fantastic questions, so thank you so much. Very provocative. So Matsuno-san writes, is it possible that how Japanese define and understand diversity is different from how people in the US would? So how would you strategize and implement initiatives that would be different? Also, the lack of exposure and experience to diverse situations are part of the reason for not knowing diversity as maybe others should. So I think all three of you with your multicultural experiences can address this, but who wants to go take this first?
I think I'll take a stab at this first, and I'm gonna make it a little bit roundabout way. I would say yes. From my perspective, I would say that Japan's idea of what diversity is very different. But if I were to zone in a little bit more, I would say Tokyo's idea of what diversity is very different. And why I say that is, as Japan's population is going down, Tokyo's population is going up, which means that Tokyo in itself, although you do have an expat community coming in, regular jobs have never really had to like change their ways when it comes to working with talent, because everyone's coming to Tokyo. What's the point? In terms of like my time in Fukuoka, I noticed that because Fukuoka has a decreasing population very early, now it's coming back up, the people in Fukuoka were forced to go out and actively seek out people to move in. And because of that, they have a different perspective of diversity. So they have special scholarships for people coming from Brazil. They have special scholarships for people who are coming from Nigeria, Kenya. They were used to doing so. When I was studying abroad, they came to pick me up at the airport. And then they go, well, we know as a Black male, you're going to have certain issues. These are the numbers you can call. These are the supports you need. This is actually a Japanese person who knows how to cut black hair in Fukuoka. That sounds very simple, but these small little things were very important to me as someone who just came to a new community. So I was able to get a haircut in Fukuoka faster than I was able to do in Roppongi because I can figure out who is a Black barber in Tokyo. So in my situation, I would say outside of Tokyo, I've noticed that I had more support because people are much more willing to help. And I think it has to do with the job market versus inside Tokyo, the feeling I got is you're in Japan now. So you must abide to the rules in Japan. You must understand what we want to do. You're very lucky to be here. We are happy to have someone like you. You can bring all you have to offer, but in the workplace or in an environment, you have to act like us. So it sounds like more like, to me, it sounds like as a foreigner in Japan, you were like this gazarimono. You were like this picture, especially in Tokyo, that people wanted to have because it looks great. But there wasn't this extra step, especially in the case of Tokyo, of people wanting to take that step forward. And then for the sake of time, giving one last example, I remember I was helping a group of students in Waseda launch a fashion show. It was called Tokyo Africa Collection, and great fashion show. They had every single resources. They had prints, they had the dresses coming from different countries. The whole continent was represented. And when I was looking at the list of models, like, great, I know a couple of African models in Japan that would be great for this show. And the student at Waseda, I won't say his name, looked at me in the eyes and said, well, we don't want African models because we're doing this show mostly for people who are Japanese. And if a Japanese woman sees those African prints on a skin color that's not theirs, they would feel disconnected.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the logic.
Yeah.
I did not understand the logic. That was pure cultural appropriation. But to them, they love the culture, but they wanted the culture, but not the person that came with the culture.
Yeah. Thank you, Stéphane. Lisa, I think you have some thoughts on this too, right?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question as well, because, as somebody who, when I worked for Fuji Terebi, I worked for Naruhodo Zawaldo. And, at that time, Japan was just kind of exploring the rest of the world. And, I'm not even sure if that show is still running, but maybe there's a reason to bring it back or kind of revive it, because it was an opportunity to showcase lots of different cultures and customs in a game show format, of course, but in a very like edutainment kind of way. And I think that, that exposure definitely helps. But it sounds like a useful conversation in Japan might be, what does diversity mean? Mm-hmm. And have everybody really talk about it and find ways in which, that can be valuable to the company, to its clients, and to, you know, Japan as a whole. And it's a pity that the Olympics were postponed, but I think that is a celebration of diversity of all kinds, from people from all over the world gathering with all sorts of amazing skills across lots of different sports. And, you know, that might be a great opportunity to tie to the discussion of diversity, or certainly draw from as an example.
No, I think that's a great idea. And in fact, I know that the Tokyo Olympic Games actually had diversity in their charter. I was actually doing a research paper for a class that I'm teaching at Hiroshima University, and I saw that, and I'll share that with you, Lisa, and the audience here as well. It's really great to see that. Well, I hate to say this, but we are up against the clock. These sessions always go by so quickly, especially because of the richness of our panelists and their experiences and their incredible. And so I'm going to have to bring this session to a close, and again, very sad. But before we wrap things up, let's ask one more poll question to the audience, if we can cue that up, as it's very important that we get this last beat in. So, how optimistic are you for a future where diversity will no longer have to be a call out? In other words, these kinds of conversations won't be so remarkable because it will just be part of the narrative. So are you very positive? Are you somewhat positive? Not positive, more needs to be done for sure, or it's really just going to take a long time for things to change? See if we can get the results really quickly. Oh no. Okay. Well, you know what? The good news, Lisa, Andy, Stéphane, I think we're going to have a follow-up session on this to really move the needle and to share your stories. We didn't have a chance to do that, and I know that was one of the polling answers, was people that people thought that our audience thought that would be one of the ways that we could really move the needle. So we'll talk to Fab and USJC about a possible follow-up. But let me just give a round of applause to our panelists. I know folks are on mute, but thank you so much, Lisa, Andy, Stéphane, for this incredible stories, and I'm sure you'll have people reaching out to you. I just wanted to have a housekeeping item here for everybody who's still here with us. There will be a feedback survey that you'll be redirected to. These sorts of programs, of course, all of us were doing things new, and we really want to hear your feedback on how important you think programming like this is, these kinds of topics are. So if you don't mind, please filling out the survey. That would be great. And also there was a question that was deleted earlier, but whoever posted and asked if this session was recorded and would be made available, the answer is absolutely yes. It will be on the USJC website, so you have a chance to be able to catch up on what you missed or share this with other folks that you think would really be able to get a lot of value out of this. So before I hand it over back to Suzanne for closing remarks, thank you so much again, arigatou gozaimasu, to the audience, to Andy, Stéphane, and Lisa. Truly such a privilege and pleasure to be with you here today on a very important topic.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rika. And as always, a wonderful job moderating and keeping a really vibrant and important conversation. So thank you. And Andrew, Stéphane, and Lisa, thank you for really sharing your stories. It was a rich conversation. I was taking down tons of notes. I just loved this idea of I can't solve my own inclusion as a way for leaders to really think about the environment, empathy, tokenism, and how that leads to isolation. I think it was really important for Stéphane to talk about that, and imposter syndrome, and how to give yourself credit to get out of that imposter syndrome. I love the idea of shedding shogunai, and I hadn't really thought about that difference between Tokyo and outside of Tokyo in terms of inclusion environments, and so that was very provocative as well. Thank you for pointing out to us, Rika, that we should share stories of success, and that's something that I think USJC would love to continue to be part of. And I'm just really fascinated by this idea of challenging from the outside, but having the internal structures to be ready for that challenge from the outside to support individuals. So really rich discussion. Thank you. I look forward to continuing the conversation. I just want to wrap up. I, of course, want to again thank Fabbit for their support to USJC and helping make this this event possible for us today, and encouraging the conversation and being a supporter of DE&I. We have a lot of other programming coming up for the rest of the year, and I really hope that you'll take a look at our website. We'll be sending you some of the links to the upcoming events. We have 2 more webinars coming up in August. You can see the details on the screen, and again, we'll be sending it to you. We're very excited to be bringing our inaugural bilateral boardroom on September 16th, 17th in Japan, and would love to have you all continue that conversation as we set the agenda for US-Japan going forward. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Have a good day.